Japan built the most powerful fortress in the Pacific. Thousands of troops, massive guns, concrete bunkers 6 feet thick. The U.S. Navy looked at it and said, "Let's just sail past it. Welcome to history of World War II, where we uncover the battles that changed everything." If you love untold World War II stories, hit subscribe and the notification bell. Here's my question. Would you attack an invincible fortress head-on or ignore it completely? Comment below. Act 1. The Fortress Empire, February 1944. The Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Empire had a problem. The Americans were coming. Island by island, battle by battle, getting closer to the Japanese homeland with every victory. So the Japanese High Command created a plan. It was simple, it was brutal, and it was based on centuries of samurai tradition. They would build invincible fortresses on the outer islands of the Pacific. They would fill them with thousands of elite troops, massive coastal guns, and bunkers of concrete and steel. They would lure the Americans into attacking these strongholds, bleeding them white in a series of gruesome frontal assaults. They believed the Americans were arrogant and predictable. They believed the U.S. Navy would have no choice but to smash itself against these walls. They believed they could make the cost so high that America would negotiate peace instead of total victory. This wasn't just wishful thinking. They had evidence it could work. November 1943, Maginot Atoll, a tiny strip of coral barely 3 miles long. The Japanese had fortified it with bunkers and guns. The U.S. Marines assaulted it in a frontal attack. The battle lasted 76 hours. More than 1,000 Marines died. Nearly 2,000 more were wounded. The entire American nation watched newsreels of bodies floating in the surf, of young men dying on beaches, of the terrible price of attacking a fortified position. The Japanese High Command studied those newsreels carefully. They saw American shock, American grief, American questioning whether this island-hopping strategy was worth the cost. And they drew their conclusion. Do this again. Make every island another Tarawa. Make the road to Tokyo so expensive in blood that the Americans give up. They called it the Z Plan, a doctrine of the decisive battle, a philosophy of making the enemy pay for every inch of territory. And so they built their empire of fortresses. Across the Marshall Islands, they transformed coral atolls into killing zones. Islands like Jaluit, Mille, and Maloelap became monuments to Japanese defensive doctrine. Let me paint you a picture of what these fortresses looked like. On Jaluit, Japanese engineers carved massive gun emplacements directly into coral rock. 8-inch coastal defense guns that could hit targets 12 miles out to sea. Reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, designed to withstand direct hits from battleship shells. Underground barracks that could house 2,000 troops. Artillery pieces hidden in camouflaged positions, invisible from the air until they opened fire. On Mille, they created a complex network of interlocking fields of fire. Every beach approach was covered by multiple machine gun nests. Every potential landing zone was pre-sighted for mortar fire. Tank traps and obstacles stretched across the coral. Thousands of troops trained in one doctrine: no retreat, no surrender. Fight until death. These weren't just military installations. They were fortresses designed to be impregnable. The Japanese had studied European fortress design. They had learned from the Maginot Line. They had incorporated the latest defensive technology: reinforced concrete, interconnected tunnel systems, multiple layers of defense, overlapping fields of fire. And manning these fortresses were some of Japan's best troops: elite infantry units, experienced naval gunners, officers who had fought in China and Manchuria, men who believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause, men who were ready to die. Admiral Manzo Akiyama, the Japanese commander of the Marshall Islands Defense Network, was supremely confident. He had deployed his forces brilliantly. The outer islands were his shield. Behind them, in the center of the defensive network, was Kwajalein Atoll, It served as the administrative hub, the nerve center that coordinated the entire defense system. Akiyama believed he understood the American mind. The American commanders are methodical, he told his staff. They lack imagination. They see an obstacle. They attack it head-on. They will strike where we are strongest because that is their doctrine. They are engineers, not warriors. He was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong he was. Act 2. The question that changed everything 5,000 miles away. In Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz sat in his headquarters studying the same maps that Admiral Akiyama was studying. But he was seeing something completely different. Nimitz was 59 years old, silver-haired, soft-spoken. He didn't look like a revolutionary. He looked like a grandfather. But behind those calm blue eyes was one of the most dangerous minds in the Pacific War, and he was staring at the Marshall Islands like a chess master staring at a board. The Japanese had made their move. They had fortified the outer islands, Jaluit, Mille, Wotje. These were their castles, their defensive line. And according to every textbook on military strategy, the Americans would have to take them one by one. Fight bloody battles for each position. Slowly grind through the Japanese defenses. But Nimitz asked a question that no one expected. Why? Why attack where the enemy is strongest? Why fight on their terms? Why accept their definition of the battlefield? Why should we attack them at all? It was such a simple question, but it shattered conventional military thinking. Nimitz had an advantage the Japanese didn't know about. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval codes. They could read Japanese communications. They knew exactly where Japanese forces were positioned. They knew which islands were heavily defended, and they knew which islands were not. And what they discovered was fascinating. The Japanese had put all their strength on the outer islands. They had fortified the perimeter. But the center of their network, Kwajalein Atoll, was shockingly vulnerable. Out of 5,000 personnel there, only 1,200 were actual combat troops. The rest were cooks, clerks, construction workers, naval administrative staff, support personnel, not fighters. Why? Because Kwajalein didn't need to be heavily defended. It was behind the shield of the Fortress Islands. The Japanese assumed no enemy could possibly reach Kwajalein without first fighting through Jaluit, Mille, and Wotje. Nimitz looked at the map and thought the unthinkable. We're going to skip the fortresses. We're going straight to Kwajalein. The room went silent. His staff officers stared at him. This had never been done before. Bypass heavily defended positions. Sail right past thousands of enemy troops. Leave them in your rear. It violated every principle of military doctrine. One officer spoke up. Admiral, we'd be surrounded. They could cut our supply lines. They could attack us from behind. Nimitz smiled. Only if they can reach us. Those fortress islands are powerful, yes, but they're also isolated. They're static. They can defend themselves, but they can't project power beyond their immediate area. If we control the sea and the air, they become irrelevant. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It was the birth of modern maneuver warfare. Don't fight battles you don't need to fight. Strike where the enemy is weak. Make their strengths irrelevant. But the strategy only worked if the Japanese believed something else was happening. Nimitz needed them to think the attack was coming exactly where they expected. So he ordered a masterclass in military deception. Act 3. The Illusion, January 1944. American carrier groups appeared off the coast of Jaluit. Dive bombers screamed out of the sky. Bombs exploded across runways and fortifications. Battleships offshore opened fire, shells crashing into Japanese positions. The bombardment was intense, sustained, devastating. Then the carriers moved to Mille. Same thing. Waves of aircraft, naval gunfire, explosions. The island shook. Then Wotje, same pattern. Bombing, shelling, destruction. to the Japanese commanders on these islands. This looked exactly like what they expected. The Americans were softening up the defenses before an invasion. This was standard American procedure. Bomb them, shell them, then land the Marines. Admiral Akiyama received reports of the attacks. He nodded in satisfaction. Just as I predicted. They are attacking where we are strongest. They will break themselves against our defenses. But something was odd. The attacks continued for days, but no invasion came. Why weren't the Americans landing? The answer was simple. Because they were never going to land. The entire operation was a feint. A magic trick. Look at my left hand while my right hand does something completely different. While Japanese commanders watched American planes bomb their fortresses, the real American invasion force was somewhere else entirely. 7 battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, 400 transport ships carrying 40,000 troops, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in the Pacific up to that point. And they weren't heading for the Fortress Islands. They were heading straight for Kwajalein. The fleet sailed in radio silence. No communications that could be intercepted. They moved at night. They stayed out of range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. They positioned themselves for an attack that Japanese doctrine said was impossible. Mid-CTA Plus audience, question number 2. If this story is blowing your mind, smash that like button so more people see it. Quick question. Is military deception brilliant strategy or dishonorable warfare? Drop your take below. Act 4. The Nightmare, January 30th, 1944. Dawn Admiral Akiyama woke up in his headquarters on Kwajalein Island. He walked out of his quarters to check on morning reports. He looked toward the horizon, and his blood ran cold. The horizon wasn't empty. It was filled with ships. Dozens of ships. Hundreds of ships. The silhouettes of battleships and carriers stretched across the ocean as far as he could see. And they weren't attacking the Fortress Islands. They were here. Inside the lagoon, inside the defensive perimeter. The impossible had happened. Akiyama ran to his command bunker. How had an entire American fleet sailed past his defenses without being detected? But there was no time to figure it out, because the bombardment was already beginning. The USS New Mexico and USS Mississippi opened fire. Massive 14-inch guns. The sound was like the end of the world. Each shell weighed as much as a small car. When they hit, they didn't just damage buildings. They erased them. The American bombardment of Kwajalein was one of the most intense in Pacific War history. More than 36,000 shells fired in the first day alone. 7,000 tons of explosives. The island disappeared under clouds of smoke and dust. Trees were shredded to splinters. Bunkers were cracked open like eggs. The defenses that had taken months to build were reduced to rubble in hours. And the guns that Admiral Akiyama had positioned to defend Kwajalein. The massive coastal defense artillery. They were all pointing the wrong direction. They were aimed outward, toward the ocean, ready to defend against an attack from outside the atoll. But the Americans were already inside. The guns were useless. Admiral Akiyama sat in his bunker as the world exploded around him. He pulled out his diary and wrote a line that captured the death of Japanese defensive doctrine. Our doctrine has failed. The enemy does not honor the rules. They fight a different war. Act 5. The extermination, January 31st. The first waves of Marines and Army infantry hit the beaches. They expected heavy resistance. They expected the kind of fanatical defense that had made Tarawa a nightmare. They expected to fight for every yard. What they found was chaos. The bombardment had shattered the Japanese defenders, and these weren't elite combat troops. The Fortress Islands had gotten the best soldiers. Kwajalein had gotten cooks, clerks, construction workers, administrative staff. Out of 5,000 personnel, only 1,200 were actual combat troops, and the American firepower was overwhelming. Sherman tanks, flamethrowers, artillery, combat engineers with demolition charges. And supporting it all, the massive guns of the battleships offshore, ready to obliterate any position that showed resistance. The battle lasted for days, but it was never really in doubt. The Japanese fought with desperate courage. Banzai charges, suicide attacks, soldiers who continued fighting even when wounded. But courage without support, without the right equipment, without proper training, wasn't enough. One American officer described it as not a battle, but an extermination. Another said it felt less like combat and more like demolition. By February 3rd, it was over. Nearly 8,500 Japanese defenders were dead. American casualties, around 370 killed. For every American who died, more than 20 Japanese soldiers fell. This wasn't Tarawa. This wasn't the meat grinder the Japanese had planned. This was something else entirely. This was a strategic knockout blow delivered with surgical precision. But the true genius of Nimitz's strategy wasn't just the victory at Kwajalein. It was what happened to the islands the Americans didn't attack. Act 6. The Forgotten Fortresses. On Jaluit Island, thousands of Japanese troops stood at their fortifications. They had heard distant sounds of battle from Kwajalein. They had received fragmentary radio reports. They knew something terrible had happened. But they were still ready, still at their posts, still waiting for the American invasion. It never came. Days passed. Weeks passed. They watched the horizon. They maintained their guns. They kept their positions ready, but no American ships appeared. Instead, they saw something worse. They saw American convoys sailing past their island, just out of range of their guns. Supply ships, warships, aircraft flying overhead. None of them paying any attention to Jaluit. The realization crept over them slowly. They hadn't been defeated in battle. They had been defeated without battle. They had been made irrelevant. The same thing happened on Mille, on Wotje, on Maloelap. All the fortress islands that Japan had spent so much time and resources fortifying. All the elite troops. All the massive guns. All the concrete bunkers. All of it was now pointless. Because the Americans controlled Kwajalein, they controlled the central hub of the Marshall Islands. They could operate throughout the region, and the fortress islands couldn't stop them. The fortresses could defend themselves, but they couldn't project power. The Japanese garrisons were cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements, no ammunition, no food. And so they waited and starved. Imagine it. You're a Japanese soldier on Jaluit. You trained for years. You're ready to die for the emperor. You've built impregnable defenses. You have massive guns. You have discipline. You have courage. And none of it matters, because the enemy just ignored you. You watch your food supplies dwindle. You watch your ammunition remain unused. You watch ships sail past, and you can't do anything about it. You're not dying in glorious combat. You're dying of malnutrition. You're dying of disease. You're dying slowly, pointlessly, guarding beaches that no one wants. The invincible fortresses became open-air prisons. Thousands of men starved to death, standing guard over nothing. Act 7. The death of a philosophy. The Battle of Kwajalein wasn't just a military victory. It was an intellectual revolution. It killed an entire way of thinking about war. For centuries, military doctrine had been built around controlling space, holding territory, building fortifications, making the enemy come to you, forcing them to attack where you are strongest. This was defensive warfare 101. The Japanese had taken this doctrine to its logical extreme. They had built an empire of fortresses. By every conventional measure, their strategy was sound. But Nimitz proved that conventional thinking was obsolete. In modern warfare, with aircraft carriers and naval aviation, with long-range logistics and mobile forces, you didn't need to control every piece of territory. You only needed to control strategic positions. The fortress islands weren't strategic. Kwajalein was strategic. So take Kwajalein and ignore the rest. This was the birth of modern maneuver warfare. Don't attack strength, attack weakness. Don't fight battles you don't need to fight. Identify what's important, strike there, and let everything else wither. The psychological impact on Japanese high command was devastating. They had spent years developing the Z plan. They had invested enormous resources. They had positioned their best troops on the fortress islands, and in 4 days, all of it became meaningless. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to play by your rules? How do you defend when the enemy just walks around you? How do you prepare for assault when the enemy fights unconventionally? The Japanese never found an answer. For the rest of the war, they continued to build fortifications. They continued to fight desperate defensive battles, but the confidence was gone. They knew now that doctrine and courage weren't enough. The Americans kept doing it. After Kwajalein came Inewa. After Inewa came Saipan. The island-hopping campaign rolled forward like an unstoppable machine. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they bypassed. But always, they chose the battleground. By the end of the war, thousands of Japanese soldiers were scattered across Pacific islands that had been bypassed. Men who had never fired a shot in anger. Men who died of starvation while their weapons sat unused. Men who had been rendered militarily irrelevant. The fortress island of Jaluit, fortified to hold off an invasion, surrendered in August 1945 without ever being attacked. Wotje surrendered the same way. Mille surrendered the same way. All the fortress islands that were supposed to be Japan's shield surrendered without firing their guns at an invasion force, because the invasion force never came. Before we finish, subscribe to History of World War II for weekly untold stories. Final question: was bypassing these islands brilliant or cruel? Let me know below. The Battle of Kwajalein lasted for days, but its impact changed military strategy forever. Admiral Nimitz proved something revolutionary. The best way to fight a strong position is often not to fight it at all. Go around it, make it irrelevant. Win the war somewhere else. The Japanese prepared for a boxing match. The Americans changed the game. Today, military academies worldwide study Kwajalein as a masterclass in maneuver warfare. It's taught at West Point. It's taught at Annapolis because it represents a fundamental truth. Mobility beats static defense. Intelligence beats strength. And the commander who chooses the battlefield usually wins. Admiral Akiyama survived the battle. He was evacuated before the final collapse. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "I learned too late that the enemy's strategy is not to defeat your strength, but to avoid it. I prepared for the war one expected." The Americans fought the war they chose. The fortress islands remained occupied until the end of the war. Some garrisons lasted until September 1945, more than 3 months after Japan's surrender. When American forces accepted their surrender, they found skeleton garrisons of starving men still at their posts, still manning guns that had never fired, still guarding beaches no one had attacked. It was the end of the age of the static fortress. The end of the belief that strong defenses alone could win wars. The beginning of the modern era of maneuver, flexibility, and strategic thinking. And it all started with one question from one admiral: why should we attack them at all? Japan built an invincible fortress. America looked at it and said, "We'll just sail past it." That's how you defeat strength. You ignore it. Thanks for watching History of World War II. I'll see you in the next episode.